waiting for everybody to kind of file in, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. My name is Jasson Schrock. I've worked all over the place. I worked at a bunch of startups in the U.S. in both New York and California. I worked at YouTube for quite a few years. I was actually the first designer hired after the acquisition, so I saw it go from a small company to a large company. After that, I also worked at Google News and led a UX design team there. I now live in Berlin, and I worked with a startup in the past there. But I've worked at quite a few different offices around the world, of Tel Aviv, Zurich, London, New York, California, Tokyo, Bangalore. So I've quite a bit of different experience talking with different people and working with different products. And I think one of the core pieces there is I quite often see UX as being seen as, this is what the designers do. This is only for designers. And I don't think that's the right mentality to have. It's really important to bring everybody into the process and to create a common language, and that's really what I wanted to talk about here today. So I want to start off first with, what is user experience? What is UX? And this is something that some people find occasionally contentious, sometimes they don't, it really depends. But I really like this graphic here where it shows all the different types of design and interactions and information architecture, motion design, everything. And user experience to me really encompasses exactly what it says, the experience from the beginning to the end. And I think that's really critical to think about it that way. It's also, you might hear it as service design. I actually think UX and service design are almost identical as far as their real goals. But as you see here, this nice blue circle shows that it encompasses quite a bit of things, or quite a few things, it's actually. And one of the core things I wanted to mention here before I move on to the next slide as well is that for me, my core belief is that it's really about the end happiness of the user. Are they happy at the end of the process? How fast you went through it, what you showed them along the way is not as important as how they feel at the end of the process. If they're not happy at the end, getting them through it fast is not, you defeated the purpose. So it's really about making sure that you take care of the user in these scenarios. Now, inside of companies, one of the problems that I was saying earlier is that I quite often hear engineering or product managers or some of the executives giving feedback that nobody knows what they're talking about. They have no idea. And I took this picture in Vienna, and I thought it was quite funny because she was having a complete conversation with the horses, and the horses just kept looking back and forth at each other, literally like what it says there, like, I have no idea what the hell she's talking about. What's really important here is that for this common language to happen, it's really about asking questions and asking the right types of questions to get and elicit feedback from that. So I broke this down into two different sections. First is UX planning questions, and it's going to kind of go into the whole kind of setup beforehand, because I think it's really critical to lay a strong foundation before you dive into any visuals, any of that other stuff, and go into the actual design of the product. So the first question is do we have the right mix? And this is really about finding what model works for your type of product. Is it a setup like this one here, where I think it's called QB model, but it's about having the business goals, the user goals, the content, and all the interactions fitting together and actually in tying together. Because if any one of these bubbles are not strong or not defined, you're going to have a really crappy UX experience. So I think it's really important to figure out what model works for you. And it's all about testing and trying these things. You're never going to find the perfect model right away. It's about finding what works best for your particular product. Now, this one here is something that I run across quite often. And I have a funny little story I can tell you about it as well too. But there's this agent story about the blind men and the elephant. A bunch of different cultures have variations on this one. And each blind man touches a different part of the elephant and perceives it as being something completely different. And it's really important to step back to see the entire process behind this. So, like I was saying before, I used to work at YouTube, and in the early days, we were starting to do a lot of testing, and quite often, we would be too specific or myopic on what metrics we were tracking. So I know everybody has been on a YouTube page before, and you see all the recommendations along the side. The the new algorithm we put there was doing amazingly well. It was testing like through the roof. It was like 300-400% higher than anything else we had there before. And it was doing so well that the PMs just pushed it to 100%. And a lot of the researchers and UX people on in the company were a little suspicious of it. And what we found out was that, yes, the click-through rate was going up by that much. What was happening afterwards is that people were leaving right away. It was essentially clickbait. So when they stepped back and looked at the entire flow, it actually was killing the user experience. So you have to be really careful about what level you're looking at during the process. And I know I talked about speed earlier, and you may have seen this item before. It was Roy Sutherland that gave it a tech talk before, or TED talk before. But he was talking about how much money was spent on improving the train from Paris to London. It was billions of pounds. And he was talking about how if you, instead of shortening the time, if you just spent a small fraction of that money and put Wi-Fi on the ride, it would make the experience so much better. And so instead of trying to make speed the critical issue, it's really about looking for psychological things to make the whole experience better. And actually, quite often, they can be cheaper that way as well, too. Now, the next question here is, are we focused on the user? And this is one that I always struggle with when dealing with different companies. And like I said before, I really believe increasing the user happiness is much more critical than any kind of speed or efficiency. Yes, from a technical backside, your back end, you really want to make sure things are working well, but it's really about how the users are at the end of the process. Now, the empathizing with the user is difficult for a lot of people in companies because they like to think, well, I'm a user. You are not the user. You are a user. You are not the user. Quite often, you are on this end. You're on the far right, which is you're the power user. You're not your everyday user. You have a very warped perception of your product. And it's great that you have that perception, but you have to keep in mind that that is not the only way. And this goes for everybody in the company. This is all these questions and all these things are things that need to be evangelized inside of a company, because I quite often had CEOs say, well, I do it this way. And it's like, yes, but 95% of the population of your product does not. Which one is more important, 95% or you? So it's really important to be flexible enough to understand that you are not the user. You are a user, you're a point on this graph. And it's really about understanding the entire base before you can really move forward. If you were in Austin's talk a little while ago, you might see a few things that overlap, but this one actually has some more details in some of the areas. A good question is this too complex? And I think that's something that happens quite often, is everybody has a whole list of ideas of what they want to do. We should do this, we should add this, we should do this. Wouldn't it be cool if we had that? And you get feedback from everybody else, and it just keeps piling up, piling up, piling up. And what you end up running into is you making the user think too much, and it's making the process way too hard to move forward. It actually can make the development of the process or of the product very slow. Excuse me, and it actually makes it difficult for the user. So I've used this in other talks before, and I think this is a really good way of understanding it. Is that imagine that this is the whole complexity of a system. This is everything: the back end, front end, design, absolutely everything. This is how complex the entire system is. Now, if you split it in half, and that green line is the interface you have with the users. One hand is how much complexity are you giving the users, how many options, how many things are you giving them to change and tweak and play with, and the other end is handled by the back end. This is way too complex. What you want to do is you want to take as much as possible and put it into the back end, make intelligent decisions for the users, Because honestly, most users will not change the default settings. You might have some power users that might want to do that. You can still have those settings, but hide them. Like, you're just going to overwhelm everybody else by having way too many controls. So keep it simple, but like as Austin was saying before, not so simple that it doesn't make sense. And I'll get into another slide about that shortly. But what's really important is to kind of think of this complexity bubble and make sure that you're not doing this and you're doing more of making it very simple for the user to understand whatever the system is. This could be a service, this could be an app, this could be a website, it could be anything that has to do with UX. Now, when you, like I was talking about before, when you have an option, you really are forcing a decision on the user. And the more decisions you give them, you end up you're fatiguing the user if you give them too many options to do. And you really want to keep it simple and move them forward through the process and whatever flow or whatever your objective is for that particular item. Now, this one here, I really love this visual. It's by Spotify. It talks about the minimal viable product, the MVP, if you want to call it that. And it talks about how you progress going from your beginning to your end. And it's great because it shows how you're going to build a car. And you want to make sure that it's pleasing all the way through, all the way through development. Because if you're building a system where you're starting with the wheels, the axle, the frame, and the body, it's just way too complex initially. Excuse me. Another way to look at it is I really like this diagram as well. And I've run across this way too many times at startups, is that they do what's barely feasible as the MVP. Feasible does not mean engaging. What you really want to do is something like this. You want to have a slice of all of it. It's got to be feasible, it's got to be useful to the user, it's got to be valuable, it's got to be delightful. If you don't hit all of these, you're going to have an MVP that sits there and does nothing. No one's going to touch it, because who wants to use feasible? You really need to have something that's tight and something that people will be willing to use. So you have to go through and slice everything in this pyramid here. Now, you have to keep in mind that there's always going to be, the return on investment versus risk, but when you do it this way, you're getting a much better sample of what's going on, and you can actually fail fast. Now, I know failing is different depending on what part of the world you're in when it comes to startups and testing things. In California, they do it quite easily. I found it when living in Berlin a little bit more resistance to that because they want to make sure they have it perfect right away. But I think it's very important that if you're going to have something fail, do it as quick as possible so you can learn from it, move on to the next thing, and build the better MVP. And one of the problems you really want to avoid is getting stuck in the sunk cost fallacy. And what happens there is that quite often I've seen startups work on products and spend so much time on it and pushing a feature out. They put all these resources into it, spend maybe 6 months, a year working on it. And it's just for a feature, not the entire product. They launch it and it flops. Doesn't do anything, doesn't work. And they end up just sitting there and not changing it. Or they might change it a little bit and nothing changes in the numbers. So instead of killing it, they keep it because they spent so much time on it. If it's useless, cut it. Get rid of it. It's just a waste of time and resources to keep updating stuff like that. Now, the next question I like to use is, will this become a habit? And one of the items that I really loved was no problem. One of the quotes I like is the toothbrush test that Larry Page, now he's the CEO of Alphabet, used to be Google, whatever it was. But it's, how do you turn this feature, this product, this service into a habit that someone's going to use as regularly as brushing their teeth? Obviously, not every service or every item or user experience is something you're going to use every day, but you do want to make it habitual. And it's really about finding the right time, finding the right hooks, and making sure that you have the right context at that moment, and moving forward on building that. Now, when I was talking about providing, collecting feedback from everybody, I think that's very, very important, especially when you're building the MVP, especially when you're testing and prototyping. And what happens there, though, is quite often you have people that will say, this is most important, this is most important, and then you end up with this whole pile of things. So it's really critical to prioritize, and I really like this method here, and I've used this quite often. It's the Moscow, I often just say Moscow by mistake, but it's kind of broken into a P0 is something that's a must-have, a P1 is something that you should have, the next is could, and next you won't. Now, I love this methodology, but I had to tweak it because I found out there was some problems with it. And the main problem is that I had to put one in between could and won't. Nice to have. Especially in California, saying something is a won't freak people out. So I don't know what the right acronym for it is anymore now. Like, I don't even want to try to pronounce that one I made up down there. So, but having an area that's, I guess the best word for it is purgatory. Like something that's in a nice to have is almost never going to see the light of day. It's the same thing as a won't, but it makes people feel warm and fuzzy that it could. This is the hierarchy I tend to use for priorities. Now, one of the things that I was just talking about is where there's all these must-haves, like we need this, we need this, we need this. When everything's important, nothing's important. You're basically flattening everything, and that's super critical when it comes to moving forward on a product. Now, what helps is you have to take these things and then rank them. Like, no matter what it is, there's always going to be something that's more critical than something else. So there might be a couple of them that are, must-haves, but everything else can be ranked otherwise. And I think it's important to make sure you use that moving forward. And for the record, that's not only a web thing. That's for all services. Like, you can always set priorities for items. So the next question here, when you're planning stuff, is are we going to test this? How are we going to plan on working on this? And I really like this simple example. I'm going to talk only about A/B testing right now, but there's a whole variety of things that you could do. But for this case study, this is an app icon in one of the stores. And they tested to see which one would work better. You had A and B, and they pushed them out, and they wanted to see what the results were. What they ended up with is that the one with the hat actually had 7.2% conversion as opposed to a 5% conversion. Now, 2.2 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you start looking at it from the larger numbers, if you have 100,000 app views, and with 5%, that's 5,000 new users. With 7.4, very simple math here, 7,400. But if you do the math between the two of those, that's actually a 40% increase compared to the last icon. So small fractions can actually bring in quite a bit, and it's really important to test features in websites, products, anything. So there was actually a really great report given by NPR by Stephen Keeps, and he was talking about how A/B testing is used in campaigns all around the world now to see if something works, something doesn't work. It's being used in schools for lessons. It's really kind of coming anywhere where they can see if one thing works better than the other, and if you can test that simply. Now, I don't want to dive into too much into the whole research thing, but when it comes to A/B testing, if you're going to do something like this, make sure you're only testing one variable at a time. When you start testing more than one variable, you have no idea why A worked better than B, so you always have to make sure that you keep it simple there. Now, there's a whole ton of other things you could do. These are just some of them. You have kind of your behavioral to your attitudinal, you have your qualitative to your quantitative, and there's tons of things you could do here. Now, in Austin's talk that he just gave just before this one, he showed something called the Rainbow Sheet, and that actually was developed by my friend Tomer Sharon, who actually wrote these two books as well. And I think these are really great resources. He just left Google, but he was a researcher on Google search for years. Now, the next area is questions that have people ask about the design process. And I think the big one here is, what is the story? And if you've ever had a startup, if you had to do anything similar along those lines, you need something like an elevator pitch. If you can't describe your feature or your idea in a story that's compelling, it's going to be really hard to get that backed up by other people inside the company. I often tell my teams that if they want to try something new, that's great, but get at least 2 other people on board with you. Because if you can't convince 2 other people to like your idea, you're almost never going to find users that like your idea. So that's not always the case, but it's a really good way to start validating items. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the monomyth before, or the hero's journey, sometimes it's called, but we've been hardwired to understand stories, because it's been a way that before writing existed, it was how information was communicated and kind of stored long term. And there's this, I think it was developed in the 1930s or 40s, I can't remember, but this monomyth is amazing how it could be applied to so many different stories. Everything from Gilgamesh from, hundreds of years ago, or not even thousands of years ago, I don't know the exact date, to Star Wars. It always starts with, an ordinary world, somebody needs a call to action, and all these things happen, and they come back, and they're a hero. If you ever get a chance, dive into it, and it's really, really interesting, and it can help with your products and how you're developing and how you're engaging people with their products and getting them excited about it as well. Before I jump on to the next one, I think something here that's really helpful is that before you start trying to recruit people for your idea, or before you start diving into what the true story is here, if you want to, this is kind of a little bit of trick that I use sometimes, is start talking to people higher up in the chain with you about your idea. Collect their feedback on it. Because when you start developing it, even if you use a fraction of their idea or even a portion of it, they're much more willing to support you moving forward. And they always like being involved in the process. And I think that's really important with all these communications things that I'm talking about, is that when you're in a vacuum and trying to push things forward by yourself, it's really difficult. So it's really about communicating with other people and getting feedback from others. And even if they see a fraction of their idea in it and you dismiss the rest of it, they're still going to be much more willing to support it moving forward. And I've seen that happen quite often. Now this is something Austin mentioned as well in his, but what is the primary action? You need to have a really clear visual hierarchy. Are you guiding the user? He actually brought up something that I use quite often as well, which is the squint test. And so if you take any visual and squint really hard, he called it the drunk test as well too. But if you can see what item it is primary and which one is to click, what's the next thing to do, that's actually a really good start. So here's another one where they do the same thing. You can see the different levels there. Now, you're also going to run into things where there's a lot of information, and you kind of get these browsing scenarios, and I think Netflix is one of them. And this is the next question, is how are we encouraging engagement? And one of the things that happens is there's a lot of products, a lot of digital products especially, where people are brought into a flow, and there isn't only one path. There is a path you would like them to do, but it's important to have pivots so they can dance around and find different things and kind of explore things and browse things on their own. Now these pivots are really critical to keeping somebody in your product. There was a prototype we did back at YouTube a long time ago where this was all done with Flash. I'm glad it's dying. But in any case, it kind of did these bubbles, and you'd start with a seed, and you just keep playing and seeing more and more videos. And the biggest complaint we got was, I wasted so much time in this, I can't count the number of videos I watched. And it's like, good, that's what we wanted it to do. But it's also really important that these suggestions you give them is not random. You can't just throw random stuff at people. It has to be something that's tangential. It has to have some kind of reference point. Even if it was in the past to what they did, you have to give some connection to it. Because if it's just random and it feels random to the user, they're not going to click it. They're not going to go forward for it. What I would highly recommend is look at some recommendation systems. There's a bunch of different research out there. A lot of it is really, really important and actually very, very helpful. Another really good example with something like this is that, and you see this quite often with hotels and different things like that now, where they have this custom blend as their default search result page. And what they do is they actually don't give you items that match your criteria perfectly. they actually put some ones that are suboptimal in there, because what the research has shown is that if you put things that are too identical and too close, it actually makes it harder for the user to decide. And if they can't decide, they're not going to move forward. Or when they do decide, they're often less happy with their choice at the end. And I remember I was talking about end user happiness. It's really critical that they're happy at the end of the process. So if you put something that's slightly less optimal next to it, it's kind of like some framing basically, but you're putting something next to it that's like, oh, well, definitely this is the choice I want. They click on it, they're happier at the end of the process, you get someone moving through the flow. It's really, really critical. So I would recommend looking into some recommendation systems and some research there, because that can be really helpful if you have products where there are lots of choices to go from. Now this one I find really interesting is, are we giving the user feedback? The user can't read your mind, they can't read your service's mind, they can't read your product's mind. They don't know what the hell is next, especially if they're a new user. Now, by feedback, it's really anything. You have to give something back to the user. So in an app, if you slide your finger up, scrolling is your feedback. Like, you see something happening. So it's really about visual feedback, audible feedback, haptic. If you have a service, again, visual and verbal. There could be some other methods as well too. It really kind of depends on what you're doing there. The only thing you really have to be nervous about is that you have to make sure that it's enhancing the experience and not detracting from it. So I was mentioning Flash earlier. I don't know if you all remember when Flash first came out. You'd have these crazy intros or these really long swipes, and it looked beautiful the first time you clicked on a menu item. When you had to do a bunch of different things, you're like, oh my God, I just want to pick this stupid thing, let me do it. So you have to be really careful in that scenario, that you're not making it too complicated. Now the last question here is this consistent? And this happens quite often as well too, especially when you're speeding and pushing through a product really quickly. You have step A, step B, step C. Great, you're going to use that multiple times throughout the process. Now if you suddenly have A, B, and the user gets D, they're going to be confused. So you have to give them some guidance along the way of why that's different. So it might be A, C1, then D. It really depends on your product or your service. So you have to be really careful about making things consistent, because as I saw in that book before, if you make the people think too hard, they're just going to abandon you. Whether your service or web, you have to be really, really careful with giving people too many options and decisions to make. So, in summary, user experience covers a ton, and it really is about going from the beginning to the end and making sure that you improve the end user happiness. Once you cover that, then you're good. But to help with spreading that inside of a company, you really have to share and let people ask questions of all designers. It has to be executives, managers, PMs. Everybody has to be willing to ask these questions, and you have to take it and understand it from a designing point of view. And you have to understand that they feel that they are vested in it. And the more they feel vested in it, the more support you're going to have in the long run. So it's really about sharing these questions and getting people to understand what these common language questions are about and what they mean. And then you can actually start opening dialogues in that way. Here are the questions that I had. This is pretty much the end of the talk. I know that I'm a native English speaker and I talk very fast sometimes. I hope everybody understood everything. Are there any questions? Silence.
I have a question related to previous Austin's talk, because he was saying that we should give UX more to the users, not to the designers, engineers, or CEOs. What do you think about this idea?
I think that's actually a great idea. I think that's where it comes with testing. I think Austin brought up a really good point about design can't be done in a vacuum. So he brought up a good point about looking at it from the user's point of view. This is about getting the points of view from inside of your company, because very often people are siloed very tightly, and this is your role. You are UX, you are engineer. Engineers aren't allowed to give any feedback about UX. That's ridiculous. Like, you have to get feedback from everybody inside of the company. Did that answer your question? Good. Anybody else? One up there.
Hi, excuse my voice. I've kind of lost it. I was just I just left the startup that I was working at because I felt that there were some symptoms of decay and that UX wasn't really in the forefront of the CEO's mind. And I was wondering, what are symptoms of when a company is kind of like ignoring UX, and like how would you go about fixing that?
So I think and I've experienced this as well too. I know exactly how you feel. Sorry you're going through that. That sucks. Oh, well, I'm sorry you went through that then. But so some of the things to kind of be aware of when that starts to bubble up is that it's still amazing, but there are a lot of startups out there that don't have any base testing whatsoever. They ignore research completely. And I think that's where Tomer's book that he was talking about there, which said it's our research. He has a bunch of different methods for how to introduce that into companies and get people excited about it. So I think that's one big symptom. Another one that I see quite often is that when startups are growing, they're doing really well in the beginning when they have a small team. And then as they start hitting successes, they start growing and everybody's like, oh, this is amazing, this is great. But then they hit this tipping point where the founders or different people inside of the organization can no longer understand everything what's going on, and they have a hard time giving that power to somebody else. That's a really scary symptom when you see that and they're unwilling to change. There's always going to be a period where they freak out for a period of time. But if that keeps continuing, you need to evaluate what's going on. And another symptom that happens with that is quite often, since they don't understand the entire system anymore, as they start learning, as they're going around through the cycle, the priorities will constantly change. And that makes it very difficult for everybody inside of the company. And when you start seeing symptoms like that, you should bring it up if you have a good relationship with the founders or whoever the management is. If that doesn't get fixed over a period of time, again, exactly like what you just did, it might be time to start looking. Any other questions? There.
Hi, I got a question more about your experience. I think, like you said, A/B testing is becoming more popular, especially we can see it probably in the release notes and mobile apps when we can't see even what's new. So probably they're just changing things in A/B testing. But I was wondering, do you always follow like A/B test results, or are there cases? Because like you said at the beginning, you need to look at the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. But on the A/B test, you just test one variable. So if there's cases in your experience, maybe when you don't need to follow A/B test results?
Yeah, I have run across that before. Now, quite often you're running the test because you know clearly what the result is that you want, and if you don't reach those KPIs, then you're going to default back. Or if you do, if it does run successfully, you pick the option and go from there. Now, where that can change is if there was a problem with the actual test itself, and I have a funny story to tell with that one in a second, or the results could adversely affect the larger system moving forward, similar to what I talked about with the YouTube example there, where yes, it worked great, and we actually did that as an A/B test. We did that as we call them percent tests, because A/B always implies that there's only two options. So as percent tests, you can literally have as many as you want at a certain percentage. But it actually did really well, but we didn't, exactly this is what the problem is, we didn't step back to see how that would affect the larger ecosystem. And sometimes I've actually had this happen before where the results come back and they're identical. And that, to me, makes me nervous. Because if they're identical, like I had one come back where I think it was 200,000 people went through that process, and the results were only off by maybe 2 or 3 people. That's too exact. There's probably something wrong with the test, or something didn't happen correctly. I mean, there is a possibility, but usually when you have an A/B test, there's enough of a change that you at least see a small variation. But when it's a fraction of a percent that's a problem, you might want to make sure that the system is built correctly. Now, to the other point, when there was a bug, well, she's now at Yahoo, but Marissa Mayer, there's a story that my former manager used to tell me that was pretty funny, is that as they were, you probably heard the story of Google testing all these different colors of blue to see what the best link would be. And when they were running the tests, there actually was a glitch in the code that put the wrong RGB number on it, so it turned the link brown. You know, a very, very small fraction of people saw it. And when it was presented to her, before they even showed any numbers, it was really funny because she's like, well, if it does better than the blue, we'll learn to love it. And it was a horrid color. It was absolutely hideous. But it's something to keep in mind. So it's really, you have to take those A/B tests or any kind of research with a grain of salt and make sure that it fits the company's needs and the user's needs. And is it feasible to actually build in the long run? I think it's that trifecta that really has to work together to take all the information and move forward. There's one right there.
Hi. How would you recommend having design not be perceived as if it's a service organization in the company and instead valid, seat at the table, and just as important as PM and Eng counterparts?
Yeah. Honestly, to do that, it's difficult and it takes time. It's not going to be something that happens overnight. So I had a very similar situation when I was asked to put together a UX team for Google News. They had never had a UX team before that, and it was, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 150 engineers between California and Bangalore. And it was really about learning how to talk in their language. So it's, again, about the communication thing. So it was about what I did there with my team is once we built it up is we started doing some tests to show that these new design patterns actually would improve the flow. What you have to be really careful with, though, is that it takes time to get results. And there's always going to be, in the very beginning, there's going to be a drop. Almost in everything I've ever done, there's always a drop. There's always a fraction of people that are users that freak out. But that fraction is going to be really small. And then usually over 2 weeks, the numbers go back up. The people don't even remember what the old version used to look like. And you take that data and you start using that to build the reputation up. And again, those books that I mentioned before, it's our research and the validating product ideas. I think both of those from Tomer are really great, and I think that they'd be really helpful in helping develop that inside of a company. Any other questions?
Hi, maybe not from UX, but from your experience. You said that you worked around the world and in Silicon Valley and now in Berlin. How do you compare Berlin as a startup center of Europe to Silicon Valley?
So actually, it's funny. I've been asked that question twice already today on different levels. What I really like about Berlin is that it's very diverse. There's a lot of technology coming in there. There's great resources to the rest of Europe and really strong talent, which I really like. I also like that it doesn't cost an insane amount of money to rent something. To give an example, I had a one-bedroom flat in Mountain View, California, which is where Google is, and I was paying over $3,000 for a small one-bedroom. It had a nice patio, but that was about it. Like, it's insanely expensive to get something that's good there. The other thing that I really like about Berlin over Silicon Valley, and don't get me wrong, I lived in Silicon Valley for over 10 years. I absolutely love that place, but it's very, very difficult to go anywhere and not hear somebody talking about a startup. Like, you walk into any coffee shop, someone's talking about their startup they're working on, or they're pitching a startup to somebody. In Berlin, I can, there's areas where there's pockets like that, but I can still walk into a bar or walk into a coffee shop and meet people of other professions. And I think that's really important, especially since it gives a broader view of the world. Because to me, Silicon Valley is great, and they actually have a lot of super smart people there, but they often don't see outside of the bubble. And a story that I like to tell quite often is that I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere near the Canadian border in the U.S. It's very, very different than Silicon Valley. So I always felt proud. I'm like, I have a foot in each side. I understand the technology and the design, but I understand the real people. And then I moved to Milan, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell's going on. So I think it's really important to mix it up in your careers and see different areas of the world, because if you don't, you're just going to get locked into one particular way of doing things, and that doesn't work for everybody. Any other questions? There.
So you were talking about how people at the beginning don't like changes and may react badly to changes. So how do you factor out this novelty effect, and what percentage of people is scary or not?
So the percentage really depends on how many users you have. So take, for example, YouTube. I worked quite a bit on the player redesign, and I did the whole information architecture for it and stuff like that. And when we were doing it and switching it out, it gets viewed now billions of times per day. So 1% is a huge number there. So you have to be really careful about what your percentage is. So it's really hard to give an exact number. But you also have to take into account, I should say, how vocal these people are going to be and how long that's going to last. And is that going to change the view of other people over the long run? One of the things that I found that helps is that if you have people that are consistently bitching, is reach out to them beforehand. Show them the design, let them complain to you personally, and then take some of their feedback into account, exactly what I was talking about, like with the execs, and then move on from there. Because if they see some of their stuff taken into account, their reaction is buffered quite a bit. Now, for example, if you have an app, another way to do this as well too is that you ask for feedback after a new design comes out, or you give them the option to see the classical and the new one until you get all the bugs worked out. But if you ask them to rate something, if they give it a 4 and a 5, say you have 5 stars, a 4 and a 5, you let them go through, let them rate it in the store. If they give it 3 or below, you don't send them to the store. You send them to another page that says, hey, what can we do to improve this? And then you also still give them the option to go to the store from there, but they almost never go on to that next step. So you're getting the feedback, but it's not being broadcast to the world, and people are hearing all these crappy comments. One of the things that I did at my former startup is that the startup was really about seeing topics from different perspectives, and that brings a lot of fighting, a lot of flame wars and stuff like that. And so what my co-founder and I did is we didn't allow comments at all. What we did allow, though, is that if you have a different point of view, back it up. Put another article in saying this is wrong. It will link it to it. You understand it, so it helped kind of grow the community and grow the different points of view without creating flame wars. Cool. Any other questions?
I think we're gonna move conversation maybe to the common area. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.
It was really cool to learn not only. Yeah, sure.